Mark chapter 8. Let's begin reading in verse number 1. It says, "In those days, the multitude being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples unto him, and saith unto them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now been with me 3 days, and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away fasting to their own houses, they will faint by the way, for divers of them came from far. And his disciples answered him, From whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? And he asked them, How many loaves have you? And they said, 7. And he commanded the people to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and he gave thanks and brake, and gave to his disciples to set before them. And they did set them before the people. And they had a few small fishes. And he blessed and commanded to set them also before them. And so they did eat, and were filled. And they took up of the broken meat that was left 7 baskets. And they that had eaten were about 4,000. And he sent them away. And then lastly, verse 10, and straightway he entered into a ship with his disciples and came into the parts of Dalmanutha. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, didn't we just read this? Didn't we just cover this miracle? Well, yes and no. We will discuss here in just a second how this is very similar, obviously, but it is, in fact, a separate miracle. Now, this is the last recorded event for us in this a circular trip that we've been talking about that Jesus and his disciples took up into the Gentile nation directly north of Galilee. And he went up to, first of all, he went up to the area of Tyre and Sidon, and then he went across the mountainous regions east of there, and then he went down, and where he is now is in the Decapolis area, which is kind of on the southeast area of the Sea of Galilee. And that is where they have been, and that is where we were last week when Jesus healed the man who was deaf and dumb, and they are still there. In Matthew's account, we read that that they had been bringing a great number of people to Jesus, and he had been healing them all. And then here in chapter 8, we see that they have in fact been there for 3 days. And so this is, again, this is the last event that we have recorded for us on this trip that we don't have the timeline for, but we can only imagine took several months to complete. And so they are there in that Decapolis area, as I mentioned, where Jesus had not only healed the deaf man, but previously on his first trip there had healed the demoniac. Now, we read last week in Matthew that I said that they were healing every person that was brought to him. And again, we don't know how many Jesus healed, but we do get the number of the crowd there here in Mark chapter 8. Now, I think we can also safely assume, and this is not specifically told to us, but I think we can safely assume that he wasn't just healing, but that he was healing and teaching as he was doing the healing. And now, our text tells us this has been going on for 3 days, at which point Jesus performs another grand miracle, one that is quite familiar to us, as it was just a couple of chapters ago that we see Jesus do that in Galilee. Now, the fact that this is kind of a repeat miracle, for lack of a better phrase, and I almost didn't cover this because I think it's fairly obvious, but there are a lot of people, a lot of more modern scholars, if you want to call them that, who say that this is simply a contradiction. They say that there were so many retellings of the first miracle where Jesus fed the multitude that Mark simply recorded 2 of those retellings. And so he didn't know which one was the right one, and so Mark just put both of them in there. Well, that's just ridiculous, but in order to firm up your belief that this is actually a separate event and is not, in fact, the same as the one that we saw back in Mark chapter 6, let me just give you a couple of these details quickly, and then we'll move on. And so it doesn't really take a close look, I think, to see that these are separate events. There's a number of differences. First of all, there's a different number of people. Here in Mark, he specifically says there was 4,000, and or in this chapter, in the previous chapter, there was 5,000. It's happening in a different area. The first time it happened in Bethsaida in Galilee. Now it's happening in Decapolis, a Gentile area. There is a different audience, as I just mentioned. The first time it happened for the Jews. This time it is primarily Gentiles. There's a different number of the loaves that were used. The first time there was 5, and this time there are 7. There's a different number of leftovers. The first time there was 12 baskets. This time there are 7 baskets. There's a different type of basket. Now, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a different type of basket. The first time where there were 12, the Greek word there is used describes kind of a small basket, something that you would typically, carry your lunch in. This time, it is a very large basket. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So it's a different kind of basket altogether. And then just a couple of verses later, which we'll see soon when we get there, but in verses 19 and 20, in this same chapter, Jesus says, when I break the 5 loaves among the 5,000, and then in verse 20 he says, and when the 7 among the 4. Jesus himself lists these as 2 separate events. And so, again, I don't think it takes a very hard look at the text to see that this is not the same event. This is a different event. Very similar, yes, but they are, in fact, different and for different purposes. And so there's no reason to see that this is just Mark saying, I don't know which one is the right one, so I'm just going to throw both of them in there. There's no reason to see this as a contradiction. And so with that said, again, I almost didn't cover that, but I thought maybe it might be important, so I went ahead and covered that. So let's go on. And so in these days, and when he says in those days, he's talking about these the healings and things that have been going on there in the Mount of Decapolis. It says that the multitude being great. Verse 2, Jesus says, I have compassion on the multitude. I have compassion on the multitude. Now, as we have said, and Jesus has been healing, and again, I think we can assume teaching now for 3 straight days. And this crowd, the thing that I find interesting about this crowd is so engrossed in watching him heal, so fascinated in the words in which he spoke, that seemingly, there's no indication in the text otherwise, that for 3 days they've just been watching him without complaint of hunger, and they've just been latching on to every word and every deed and act that Jesus did. And so for 3 days they've been doing this, and finally Jesus is the one to stop this. It wasn't the crowd interjecting and saying, hey, before another healing, could we possibly get some bread? We're starting to get hungry. No, Jesus is the one who stopped and said, guys, listen, I have to stop. I've got compassion on this crowd, and they need to have some sustenance. And so we saw at the end of chapter 7 that the people who brought the deaf man, it says that they were beyond measure astonished. That they were beyond measure astonished. We read back in Matthew chapter 15, we saw this last week, that the same crowd, this is who Matthew's talking about, it says that the multitude wondered and they glorified the God of Israel because of the things that were going on. In fact, when you go back and you look at that Matthew passage, it talks about the various groups of and kinds of people who were being healed. And one of the words that I find most interesting in Matthew 15, if you look at this, one of the words that it says is that even the maimed were being healed. And you look at that word maimed, and that could possibly be a lot of things, but one of the things that word could possibly refer to is someone who has lost a limb. And so it's very possible that Jesus was quite literally before their eyes recreating limbs on these people. And I don't think it would be hard to imagine how they were beyond measure astonished. I cannot believe what my eyes are seeing. And again, I think we can assume I cannot believe what my ears are hearing. We've seen throughout the book of Mark that people were absolutely astonished at his doctrine. They were astonished at his teaching. Why? This man teaches with an authority that we have not heard before. And so for 3 days, this crowd just sits there absolutely engrossed. I can't even imagine what it would take to get a group of people this size, that engrossed for 3 days, that they don't even stop to think about, hey, our stomachs are grumbling a little bit. I think it's time to get some fish. But that's what's going on. And so Jesus was astonishing people everywhere that he went. And this particular crowd, Gentile or Jew, it didn't seem to matter. They were absolutely amazed at the deeds and the words of Christ. So for 3 days, this group is immersed in what Jesus is doing. And now Jesus stops. Again, he's the one to stop this. He stops to give them food to eat. Now, Jesus looked at this crowd of Gentiles, and again, I think that's very important. He looks at this crowd of Gentiles, and in verse 2, I have compassion on the multitude. I have compassion on the multitude. Now, what is interesting about this phrase, this is, believe it or not, this is the only time in the Gospels where we actually read those words coming from the mouth of Christ. Now, it has been said about him a number of times. A number of times in Mark already we have seen where it was said about Jesus, he had compassion. He had compassion towards this group, towards this person, towards this crowd. But this is the only time in the Gospels where from his mouth we hear the words, I have compassion. And again, it's interesting to see that it was towards this group of Gentiles. And as we mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, I forget now, but were the only 2 times in all the Gospels where Jesus mentions the great faith of somebody. Both of them Gentiles, not Jews. Both of them Gentiles. And so there are, again, as I said, many references to his compassion, but they're all third person. This is only first person reference to the compassion of Christ. And so Jesus was moved to act in a miraculous way, and this is another thing that's kind of interesting about this, for a group who was in no real, lasting danger. I want you to catch this. This group was in no real, lasting danger. Jesus says, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. So they had gone 3 days with no food. Now, I'm not trying to diminish the fact that they had gone 3 days with no food. But what I'm simply trying to emphasize is that whereas they would be incredibly hungry, there's no doubting that, a person can go significantly longer than 3 days with no food, assuming that they had water. A person can go significantly longer than 3 days with no food before it actually becomes a problem. And think about the person who is saying he has compassion. Not only did Jesus, in the beginning of Mark, go 40 days on a fast in the wilderness, and so from an experiential standpoint, he knows and he understands that they can go significantly, weeks longer than what they have gone without food before it actually becomes a problem. But also think about it from this aspect. He's the one who created their bodies, and he understands how it works better than anybody else. He knows that after 3 days, they don't have to eat now before this becomes an actual lasting issue. The body can go a long time without food, again, assuming water is there, but the body can go a long time without food before it becomes an actual problem. And yet still, this was enough to draw the heart of compassion of Christ as he's looking out upon this group of Gentiles, and he says simply, they're hungry. And that is enough for me to stop what I'm doing and perform this great miracle. Now, I do admit, in verse 3, he says part of the reason he's worried is that there's the potential that they could faint by the way. Now, some of them had, we can assume, come a long way. Jesus himself says some of them have come a long way. And we got to also acknowledge that, they didn't hop into their car and drive away. They're walking, and some of them would be walking great distances. And yes, if you are very hungry, you get tired more easily. You get a little bit weaker. And there was the potential of some of them. But obviously we understand that Jesus didn't mean that if I don't stop and feed them now, this entire crowd of 4,000 plus people is about to faint right here. That's not what he was saying. And so Jesus' heart was pulled with compassion towards this group because of a little bit of a physical hunger. This shows the great love of Christ. Listen, this was not a spiritual concern. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about this particular miracle. This was not, now it had spiritual implications, but this was not a spiritual concern. At this moment, Jesus looking out at this crowd, this is a physical concern. He loves them. He wants to provide for them. However, as I said, it was a physical concern that posed no long-term threat. It was something cured by eating, and it would go away. But this was enough to draw out the compassion of Christ for him to do what he was about to do. Now, compassion like this, if you think about this in comparison to other false religions out there, compassion like this is absolutely unheard of in the other false gods, other false religions. You don't hear of something like this. And every other religion is about, you must do everything you can to please me in order for me to not come down and condemn and do all these things. But you don't ever read in all these other religions of a God having such a heart of compassion towards whoever it is that's following or worshiping him that he would stop and perform a miracle like this simply because of a little bit of hunger. You don't read that. It makes sense while we read in 1 John 4:19, we love him. Why? Because he first loved us. Listen, God is not drawn to us because of our great love to him. We are drawn to him because of his great love for us. Passages such as this here in Mark chapter 8, passages such as this give us a glimpse into the depth of this love. It goes beyond our spiritual needs, in fact, to our very physical. Now, I want to say this. That is not to say that God is going to miraculously provide for our every physical need. Sometimes it is the will of God that we go without. Sometimes it is the will of God that we suffer, but that even our physical needs reach the very heart of God. So I don't want to confuse the matter. But then let's look here at verse number 4, because his disciples ask him a rather curious question. The disciples answered him, "From whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness?" Now, as I said, this is a very curious question. There are really three ways that this particular question can be interpreted because the issue is at hand. Yes, Jesus has done this miracle before, and it perhaps has been a few months, but something like that you would surely expect the disciples would not forget anytime soon. And so the fact that they ask a question like this, it leads people to wonder. So again, there's really three ways. Let me give you these quickly. Number one, maybe, perhaps, they have just forgotten the former miracle. I think that's unlikely, but let's throw that out there as an option. Maybe that's the case. It's been several months. Many things have happened. We've read about several incredible events. We know that in the book of John, in John's Gospel, John actually writes, listen, nobody has even come close to writing all the things that Jesus did because the books in the world could not contain all the things that Jesus did. And so we don't know how many things happened. We have some very incredible, miraculous things that we have seen since that last feeding miracle. And so perhaps, they did. They just forgot. Again, I think that is incredibly unlikely. But we have to throw that as an option because the text does not tell us. And now, if that were the case, it does lead me to this truth that I think sometimes we are quick to forget the blessings of God. I think sometimes we are too quick to forget how He has brought us through certain things in the past. I think sometimes we get into trouble, we face difficulty, we're in some kind of trial, whatever the case may be, and instead of thinking back upon the past mercies and grace of God, we sit there and think, well, I guess He's forgotten me this time, and I have no idea how this is going to happen, because I think we are quick to forget. I think we are quick to forget the love and the depth of the love and the grace and the mercy of God instead of relying upon the past graces and mercies of God. This is a constant theme throughout the Bible, over and over and over again in the New Testament specifically. God says, remember what I did. Remember when I brought you out of Egypt. Remember when I brought you through the wilderness. Remember when I brought you into the land. Why does He say that over and over and over again? Because people forget and they don't think about the goodness and the grace of God and how He's done for them in the past. It's all about, what are you going to do for me now? And they don't rely upon the past goodness and the past grace of God. Now, all that to say this, I don't think that's what the case was. I don't think they forgot. Secondly, another option, they didn't forget, but they simply didn't think that He was going to do this for Gentiles. Now, that's maybe a little uncomfortable, but it's the truth of the matter. On this very trip, just a couple of, in chapter 7, on this very trip, Jesus had reminded them that He came first to the lost sheep of Israel. When the woman comes to Him, his daughter has the demon, Jesus tells her, in Matthew's account, Jesus tells her, listen, I've come to the lost sheep of Israel, and actually tells His disciples. We know how the Jews felt towards the Gentiles, and we would be lying to ourselves if we thought the disciples were any different. Listen, these were Jews. These were grown men who have been raised in this system of hatred and bigotry towards the Gentiles. I mean, it was to the point where the rabbis and the Pharisees commanded that if you were going to a Gentile area before leaving the Gentile country and entering back into Israel, you have to stop and shake the dust off your feet, lest you bring Gentile dust into the land of Israel and defile the land. Listen, the hatred was deep. It was severe. And again, we can't think that the disciples were above this. Hopefully it was lessened the more that they got to know Christ. I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more later. So perhaps they didn't forget what Jesus had done. They know full and well that yes, He can. But this is not Jews. This is not the lost sheep. This is Gentiles. Maybe they're simply thinking, He's not going to do that here. In fact, if you remember back to that very woman who came to Jesus with the daughter who had the demon, what did the disciples say? Jesus, send her away. Get her out of here. It's not why we're here. Don't help her. We've got things we need to be doing. Don't worry about this. So perhaps that was the answer. Thirdly, maybe this was their way to encourage Jesus to act without actually telling Him what to do. This is another option. So by asking the question in this particular way, again, the question they says, from whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? So some say, well, they ask it in that way specifically to encourage Jesus. No man can do this. If this is going to be done, it must be done by somebody who's not a man, somebody who's above, somebody who's greater. And so the only thing to suggest this may be the case is the lack of some of the doubting phrases that we saw by the disciples the first time this took place. Now, the first time Jesus fed the multitude, they complained, right? We only have 200 pennyworth, Jesus. That is not enough to buy food for all these people. There's no way this can be done. Furthermore, after finding the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, Andrew says to Jesus, he says, "But what are they among so many? It can't be done." And so we don't see any kind of phrases like that here. And so it could be that this was simply the disciples encouraging Jesus to do this without telling Jesus to do this. Now, after they find the loaves, again, we see no such doubt in Jesus' ability to do what he was about to do. And so all that say, we don't know. We don't know the exact reason why they asked this. Perhaps this was a lack of faith. Perhaps this was simply them saying, listen, it ain't going to happen for the Gentiles. Perhaps this was them just saying, Jesus, listen, man can't do this. Maybe somebody else can, but man can't. You know, we don't know. We don't know the exact reason, but they come to them and they ask him, again, this kind of curious question. And Jesus often, when you read through the Gospels, a lot of times you'll see that Jesus responds to questions, but not normally in the way that people expect. I think that's kind of what happens here again in verse 5. And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? So again, they come to him, Jesus, man can't do this. How many loaves do we have? What do we have? We then see again the power of Christ and the miracle itself. Now this time they were able to find 7 loaves and a few small fishes, as opposed to what they had the first time. Now, the number of people we see there in this chapter, the number of people was 4,000, but again, just like the first time, Matthew adds beside women and children. So 4,000 beside women and children. Again, that's not an exact number, but we can assume, like we did the last time, that this is a number at least 2 to 3 times above the 4,000. And so again, he has the crowd sit. The first time he had them sit in rows and in groups. Again, we're going to assume that he did the same here. He's a detail-oriented God, and so I think that he probably did the same here. And again, the same thing happens. He gives thanks and he multiplies the loaves and the fish. And again, this was a creation miracle. This was a creation miracle. Jesus takes 7 loaves and a few fish, and then they just begin to multiply in front of the eyes of this group of people. He created bread and fish where there was no bread and fish. This would have been amazing to see. Thousands of loaves of bread and thousands of fish simply appear. I think we can assume this was probably the best meal that this group of people ever had. Think about it from this perspective. This was bread made without grain grown from the cursed ground. This was fish created outside of the curse of sin. I would imagine that there was never food, fish, or bread that tasted so good. Jesus created an abundance of food so that everyone ate, and again, we see that they were filled. It's not that they just had a little bit, had as much as they could possibly need or want. That word means satisfied. It's the exact same word where the disciples used when they asked, from whence can a man satisfy these men with bread? It's the same word. Man couldn't, only God could. So the disciples are saying, there's no way that man could satisfy this crowd, and yet Jesus performs this miracle. They were in fact satisfied. When everyone finished eating, we see that there are 7 baskets left over. Now I said I'd come back to this. These are 7 large baskets. Again, this is verse 8. So they did eat and were filled, and they took up of the broken meat that was left 7 baskets. Now, that word baskets, this was a different word that was used from the first miracle. Outside of this miracle, in this account and in Matthew's account, outside of this miracle, the only other time that this word is used is in Acts chapter 9. And in Acts chapter 9, what is going on is Paul is basically needing to escape Damascus, and they lower him over the walls of Damascus in a basket. That's the same exact word used as basket in Acts chapter 9 as it is here. What does that tell us? This is a large enough basket for an adult male to fit into, and it was sturdy enough to hold him down over the wall. So again, that doesn't tell us exact dimensions or how sturdy these things were, but a large basket, and they filled 7 of these with the leftovers. So again, we can only begin to contemplate the number of loaves and the fish that Jesus created. Again, you can understand why this was such a defining miracle the first time it happened, to see something like this before your eyes. Now, we're not told what was done with the leftovers. We weren't told the first time, we're not told this time. But we can assume that they were put to good use somewhere by somebody as Jesus was he would understand and he would know the proper amount to make without being wasteful. So I think we can just assume that whatever was done with them, they were used in a proper manner. Now, by way of conclusion this morning, just to go over this part quickly here in verse number 10, it says, "And straightway he entered into a ship with his disciples and came to the parts of Dalmanutha." I just wanted to cover this quickly. After feeding, they enter into a boat. They go across the Sea of Galilee up into the northwestern side, and they go to an area called Dalmanutha. Now, just a quick note on this particular town. In Matthew's account, and again, some see this as a contradiction. In Matthew's account, it says that they go to Magdala. The area of Magdala, like we would think of Mary Magdalene, the area of Magdala. Many, again, see this as this is contradicting accounts here. Now, the truth is, no one knows exactly where Dalmanutha is. We have not been able to find it. Some people think that they have, but we don't have any actually affirming evidence that it was, in fact, Dalmanutha that they have found. However, the prevailing thought is that Dalmanutha is very near to the area of Magdala. And another thing to keep in mind here is that it says there in verse 10 that they came into the parts of Dalmanutha. It doesn't say specifically that they went exactly into it, but that they went to the parts of it, the area of it, the roundabout area of Dalmanutha. And so it very well could be no different than somebody saying, I'm going to Dallas, when in fact they were going to Irving or something, along those lines. And so this is not a contradiction, it's just a different way to say it. And so when we think back to the first miracle, and I just wanted to get that, I want to make sure people understood that. When we think back to the first miracle, as I just said, it was the defining miracle in Israel. Of all the things that Christ did, there was none more remembered than the fact that Jesus fed this grand multitude of, we can only assume, 15 to 20, possibly more, thousand people. And we understand that it was the defining miracle because it is the only one outside of the resurrection that is listed in all four Gospels. Of all the great, amazing things that Christ did, that is the only one that is listed in all four. And so it was kind of seen as this a grand, defining moment. And again, there was nothing that was done by Jesus that was on a more grand scale. As far as the number of eyes that actually witnessed what He did, the number of people who were actually satisfied by the fish and by the loaves. And so it was seen as this amazing thing that Jesus did in Israel. And so again, this is likely due to the sheer scale of it all. Now, as we said then, it is the only miracle in all four. And so the reason why I mention that is because now that is the miracle, this defining miracle, that is the one that Christ then performs here as the last act before He leaves this Gentile land to come back into Galilee. I think that's significant. And so as we have said, we said this when Jesus first started to take this trip in Mark, that this was a chance for Jesus to get away, to spend some time with His disciples, to teach them, to disciple them. And so he has taught them, as I said a while ago, He has taught them that He came to them first, right? I've come to the lost sheep of Israel. That was the purpose of His trip. I come here first. He came to them. But He has shown them a few times already in this Gentile trip that He has a love and a compassion for the Gentiles that is really no different than His love and His compassion for Israel. And that the same way that He acts towards them is extended out towards these Gentiles. He healed the woman's daughter, and He has healed, again, countless number of people over the last 3 days here of this trip. And then He repeats this defining miracle of Israel here for this Gentile crowd. And so now He's taught them that what first came to Israel is not going to end with Israel. And I think that's the point. Again, this miracle was clearly important in the ministry of Jesus. It was the miracle that led Christ to tell everybody that He was the true bread. It was the miracle that after the teaching about what it represented, that many of His own disciples began to leave Him and did not follow Him anymore after that particular miracle. It was that miracle that Jesus looks at the 12 and He says, "Are you too going to leave?" And Peter responds, he says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life." This was an important point in the ministry of Christ. And He took all of that and He brought it to the Decapolis area, to these Gentiles. To have that replicated for this other group should have sent His disciples a clear message. There should have been no reason for the disciples to wonder whether the kingdom was also for the Gentiles. They get it. They understand that it's for Israel. But there should have been no reason that they misunderstood that it didn't end with Israel. Now, I say this kind of sadly, I guess, that it seems as if they did miss this. Because we know that later on in the book of Acts, it wasn't until Peter has this grand vision with Cornelius, where Christ lets down this sheet with all these supposed unclean food in it, and Peter tells him, "No, I have not eaten anything unclean in my life." And God tells him, "Rise, kill, and eat." And Peter, he rejects it. "No, I won't do it." And then God says, "Don't you call unclean that which I have called clean." So it seems as if they missed the message. They didn't get it. And we say, well, how could that be? I mean, look at what he did. Again, I implore you to understand the culture with which they were raised. This was deep-seated. This was rooted in them, that Gentiles, they weren't just the different people, that they were dirty. That just by contact with them made you unclean. And so they seem to have missed the message. But I believe what Jesus was doing here was showing them, and you would think quite clearly, what was brought to Israel does not end with Israel. It extends to the Gentiles as well. Now, after this miracle, I'll say this in closing, after this miracle, Jesus leaves and he enters back into Galilee, and it would not be long. He does a few other ventures out to a couple of different places, but it would not be long after this before he makes his way down to Jerusalem and then eventually to his death and his resurrection. However, Jesus leaves the Gentiles with hope. I think that was the lasting message here. What was done for Israel will be done for you. It is, as Paul said, to the Jew first, but it is also to the Greek. Jesus was showing the disciples what he told the Jews after the first feeding. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. It's not just for you. It's for the world. What did God tell Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12? That there's coming somebody from your seed that's going to be a light to the world. It's going to be a blessing to the whole world. And so just as what Jesus was telling them, yes, it's come to you. You are highly blessed. You are highly favored, and that is to you first. But it does not end with you. And we, again, as Gentiles here this morning, I think ought to be incredibly grateful for this particular miracle, because it was not just done for them. It was done for us as well, to show that what began at Israel extended out to us. And we have been, to use the words of Scripture, grafted in. And we are a part of the promise and the blessing today. Let's pray.